are the advantages of participation in international student mobility? So there are lots of surveys showing that students are very happy with the experience, but there are also causal impact evaluation studies that really measure the causal impact of participating in student mobility. And there we find that there are increases of tolerance, multiculturalism, more feeling of being integrated in Europe. But there's also research that shows that international student mobility improves students' professional careers, like, for example, language competences, decisions on future educational pathways, employment chances are improved, and also higher wage growth. So it's really beneficial in terms of positive experience and future careers to take part in international student mobility. Next slide, please. So, but it is quite well known that the disadvantaged students participate less in international student mobility. And this is something that Kristina, who will be talking later on, already showed in 2015 for all European countries. Here I just show it for the 4 countries I have graduate data on. So if you look at Germany, here we have about 35% of students who are advantaged. So they have at least one parent who completed tertiary education, who participate in international student mobility, while it's only 24% of those students who have non-tertiary educated parents. So we have here something like a 10 percentage point gap. In Hungary, we also have a 10 percentage point gap. Then there's a gap around 5 and 7% in Italy and the UK. And I just want to attract your attention to this. So later on, I will talk about which kind of characteristics can decrease this percentage point gap that I show you here. But just that you are aware that also the ratio matters. For example, in Germany and Hungary, you have the same size of gap, okay? But for every disadvantaged student in Hungary, 3 advantaged people go in international student mobility. Whereby in Germany, for every disadvantaged student, only 1.4 advantaged students go to mobility. And in Italy, and the UK, every disadvantaged student has something like 2 advantaged students going to mobility. So this presentation is about the gap, the percentage point gap. It's not about the ratio. Next slide, please. Okay, why is this actually a problem? Why is it a problem that we have disadvantaged students taking less part in student mobility? And there are 2 reasons, okay, why that I see. The first one is we use public money normally for funding international student mobility. And this means the public money is more used on the advantaged than the disadvantaged students. That's not the idea of the organizer of international student mobility schemes. Second, I just showed you that those students who take part in international student mobility have better career chances later on. And hence there's quite a lot of sociological literature which now starts saying, look, international student mobility increases social disparities. Okay, so it's certainly something that's on the radar of policymakers and whatever kind of a policy document we read on, for example, Erasmus+. There is a big word, which is inclusion. But the big problem is, how can we increase inclusion? How can we make this scheme more equal so that disadvantaged students take part as well? Okay, and I think the problem is that we don't know enough about the mechanisms. And one reason for that is that the literature takes a student-centered approach. So, for example, we know very well, it has been very well documented, that disadvantaged students suffer of a lack of financial resources. They tend to perceive international student mobility as less beneficial. They have lower mobility experiences, lower language skills. They are less informed about the scheme, and they have, on average, lower ability. Next slide, please. And the question, so at the end, at the moment, most of the research is about, it's a student choice, and hence we look at students. But what I want to convince you today with this presentation is that we need to go beyond the student-centered approach, and we need to look at things like university, degree course level, at the meso level, how international student mobility is organized. Okay, and this has already been argued in the literature before, but it hasn't really been done up to now. The reasons for that is that student mobility uptake depends on the opportunities the universities provide, and consequently, we need to look at the universities. We also see that individual characteristics cannot explain a huge share of the gap. So something else must be going on, and that's likely to be at this meso level. And there's research, first research showing that students' environment does matter. And from a practical point of view, think about, I mean, policies that want to change the gap, that want to decrease the gap, they would need to focus on individual characteristics. If you just focus on individual characteristics, if you focus on a meso level, it's much easier to implement policies at the university or degree course level than at the individual level. Next slide, please. Okay, so at the Joint Research Center, we therefore have been looking at other possibilities to go beyond the student-centered approach. And this is not quite easy. That's challenging. And I think that's why researchers normally cannot do it, because what we need is we need high quality graduate data. So first study we did was to look at, do universities matter beyond students, you know, and we found they do. The second one, that's the one I want to present to you today. Can we say something about which universities are important? And there we look at these four countries I mentioned before, and you'll see that in a second. And then the new research, which I'm currently doing with a colleague, that is on data selection into Erasmus participation, how this impacts and degree course organization. So I want to give you very brief, just touch of what our results are on that. Next slide, please. Okay, so can we say something about which universities are important? So next slide, please. So given that, as I said, the Erasmus program is a feature program in some way, because most of the mobilities in Europe are based on the Erasmus program, just some words. It does not aim to provide the entire expenses. It provides additional living expenses, which at the time of the survey data we examined was about 300 euros per month, plus about 100 to 200 per people from disadvantaged backgrounds. The program itself has no merit-based requirements, because it gives the grants to national agencies, which then distribute it within their country to the universities, but not necessarily on ability. That's not written anywhere. But within the universities have less grant than people who are interested, and hence they select by ability normally. And what is important to know, students can only go to university for which the university in which they are based has an interinstitutional agreement. Next slide, please. Okay, so the research question is really, do universities matter for explaining the socioeconomic gap in the uptake of Erasmus, of international student mobility? And there are some thoughts about this. So for example, you could think about student support. A university which provides extra student support might have a lower gap, because it's a disadvantage to benefit more from this student support. So you could, for example, say a student, we do not have a variable on student support. I'm very sorry, that's what we don't have. But we have a variable on university excellence. And you could say, if a university wants to be excellent, it crowds out student support. You could think that. You could also think that if there's a high teaching load, professors help less with applications. And if you have a big university, you could think, oh, they might have a student support office for international student mobility. So these variables might be all very interesting, as well as in some way social segregation in universities, because if in disadvantaged students are clustered in a specific kind of universities, it's important to see what kind of universities that are. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, we focus on 3 countries, Hungary, Germany, Italy, and the UK. And the point for that is more to find out the similarities, whether we find a similar picture. At the moment, I only know 4 other studies that compare countries. And the point is that the differences in country contexts, the number of differences in country contexts that could be explanatory, are much bigger in size than the number of countries we have. So we cannot really explain country patterns, but we can look at similarities. Next slide, please. Okay, so which kind of data we use? So we use 4 graduate surveys. For Germany, the DZHW graduate panel. For Hungary, the Hungarian graduate career tracking system. For Italy, the eStart University Graduate Vocational Integration Survey. And for the UK, the Higher Education Statistics Agency graduate data. So the UK data is administrative data that explains why we have more than 200,000 students in 151 universities. Germany and Italy, that are representative graduate surveys, okay? And Hungary is not a representative survey. The cohort year of graduation is between, we didn't find the same years, it's between 2009 and 2015. However, for all 4 surveys, we have very similar variables, which makes it possible for us to compare the countries. Next slide, please. The big thing about these 4 graduate surveys, something very special. They have information on which universities students attend. And a lot of surveys do not have that. So we normally cannot access information on which university students go, okay? But given that we have this university variable, we can add information to our graduate survey by merging our survey data with the European Education Tertiary Register, which is a data set that includes in-depth information at the university level. And that's what we do. So we have, in some way, a very rich graduate data set, plus additional university level variables. Next slide, please. Okay, what's the method? The method is the following. So I already told you about the gap between disadvantaged and advantaged students taking part in mobility, okay? And our method, what we do, we try to show how this unconditional gap, so the one that I showed you, 10%, or was what in Germany and Hungary, 7 in Italy, 5 in the UK, how this decreases if we take into account other individual and university factors. So we do first something that the studies do that are normally around, so only focusing on the individual level. Okay, so we run single level logistic regressions and show you how the gap decreases. And then second, we add the value added, which is we add university characteristics. Our dependent variable is uptake of international student mobility, which is 1 if there is uptake, so otherwise. And the explanatory factor, so the gap I'm talking about, that is just also dummy, which is 1 if the student has no parent educated at tertiary level. Next slide, please. What are the results? Next slide, please. Okay, here are just some very descriptive statistics, and I don't have enough time to go into that. I would like to raise your attention for the university levels here, because what we do, we don't only use ETA data for university level, but we also construct university level data based on our survey data. For example, we have the share of students with low socioeconomic background by university. We focus on that, so we create that variable. So that's the second last on the slide. And we also have the share of low ability students within university to look at. Next slide. And here you see the ETA variables that we use, for example, the size of the university, teaching load, and so on. And also research excellence, okay? Thank you very much. Next slide. Okay, so what are the results? So here you see the multi-nested, multi-level logistic and multi-level logistic regression results. So let's start very simple. We just focus on the individual level characteristics. So if you look here at L1, so that's our logistic regression 1, which is a very simple logistic regression because it has just mobility as dependent variable and only 1 explanatory variable, and that is whether the student has low parental, so whether the student's parents have low parental education. And there you see a gap. For example, for Germany, you see minus 0.088. These are marginal effects. So that means that in Germany, unconditionally, students with lower educated parents have an 8.8 percentage points lower probability to attend international student mobility. So in Hungary, it's 10%, 10.5, in Italy, 5.8, and in the UK, 4.3. Okay, so this is a gap the unconditional gap. So what about ability? If we code ability constant, does the gap decline? So that's because if it would decline, then ability would explain the gap in the uptake, okay? So what we do, if you now look at L2, you see low ability, and you see for Germany, there's written minus 0.128. That means that if you have low ability, so you're in the lower quarter of the upper secondary school results in Germany, your probability to take part in Erasmus decreases by 12.7 percentage points. And we see, for Hungary, we don't have the ability variable, but for in Italy and UK, you see it decreases. Having low ability, you have lower probability to take part. But that's not really, that we know from the literature. What is interesting is how does a coefficient for low parental education decrease? And you see it decreases for the UK because in L1, we had something like a gap of 4.3 percentage points. Once we condition on ability and keep ability constant, then the gap, it decreases to 3.4. So we have a 25% reduction in the gap if we condition on ability, but we don't find that for the other two countries. Okay, so ability is some kind of explanatory factor. It is important, but it's not really in Germany and Italy a big explanatory factor of the gap. Okay, then we can say, okay, let's look like other research on individual characteristics with the gender, age, and so on. And what we see is that indeed the gap decreases a bit in Germany, and it decreases in Italy a bit. And it decreases also in Hungary, and the main reason is older students. Okay, so older students have a much lower probability to take part, and they are also coming from more lower socioeconomic background, and that explains this decrease in the gap. And then we can also condition on field of studies, and you see that doesn't do much to the gap. So, for example, in Germany, we have with L3 a gap of 7.2 percentage points. Once we focus on field of study, it's still the same, for all countries, it's the same. This exception of the UK, because there from L3, we have something like a gap of 3.2 percentage points, and then it decreases to 2.1. And this is due to segregation into field of studies in the UK. Okay, so, but just focusing on individual level characteristics, you see that we cannot explain much of the socioeconomic gap in Erasmus uptake. And there are two reasons for that, okay, in my opinion. The first one is we don't have the right individual level characteristics. Look, because I think what would be very nice is to have information on finances of students. We don't have that. We don't have that. It would be nice to have something on mobility. It would be nice to have something on whether they had previous experiences of traveling abroad and so on. We don't have that. But let's assume we all had that. What do you think? That we could explain the entire gap? I don't think so, because that's what I want to convince you. I think it matters also. Universities matter. So this is why we run a multi-level model, and that you see here with ML0. That's a null model. A null model has only random effects at the university level. It has no other explanatory variable. And what you see, for example, if you look at the UK, you have a value of 0.39. That means that 39% of the variation in Erasmus uptake can be explained by universities, by in which universities you are. So in the UK, universities do matter for Erasmus uptake. And in Italy, it's 22%, Hungary 7%, and in Germany 12%. So universities can explain variation in mobility uptake, and that makes them think, oh, and might be also explain the inequality in the uptake. And the model L1, the results that you see there, they are the same as it's the same model as L4, okay? But we take university level into account. And what you see, there's a decrease for actually two countries. For Hungary, we had this L4, an 8.3 percentage gap for the students with low educated parents, and now it's now it's 7.1, okay? And for the UK, there's a 25% decrease. So clearly taking universities into account for two countries decreases the gap by about 1 percentage point. Then we also, I don't show that here, but we also then add university characteristics. into the model, and the gap doesn't decline much further. And in my opinion, this is because we lack the right university level characteristics. Next slide, please. But another way, in some way, to focus on the disadvantage is to look at how students are clustered in universities. So here you see on the y-axis the percent of mobile students by university. Every single dot here is a university, okay? For example, in Germany, you see that there are universities where there's only between 5 and 10% of students go on Erasmus, go on international student mobility. Thereby, there are some universities where it's more than 50%. Okay, so you see here high disparities across universities on the offer of mobility programs. Okay, on the x-axis, on the x-axis, you have the percent of students with low parental education. Okay, and here we see the biggest differences in the UK. There's a university where there are only 10% of students with low socioeconomic background, and there are others where it's 60%, 60 to 70% of the student body in the university has low socioeconomic background. The main point why I show you that is a very similar picture across all 4 countries. We see that disadvantaged students are mainly clustered in those universities with lower mobility uptake. Okay, so we have a high negative correlation, significant for all 4 countries. So this shows the double disadvantage of disadvantaged students, because not only does that due to the disadvantage and that due to their background, they're less likely to enroll, but they're also less likely to take part in international student mobility, but they're also more likely to be in a university. There are less mobility opportunities. Next slide, please. Okay, I just want to show you a little bit, because that's a great beauty in some of the data that we have university variable characteristics. And we actually looked at this, what I just showed you as a point of social segregation within universities. So the share of students with low socioeconomic background, that's social segregation, right? And we plugged this into our model as a university variable. And for example, if you look at Hungary, you see something like a 0.208. So this translates into the following interpretation. If you increase the share of disadvantaged students by 1 standard deviation, then the uptake decreases by 8 percentage points in Hungary. Okay, so you just move your university, you move this, and yeah, you just increase the share of disadvantaged students as less uptake. Another point of segregation is by ability. Okay, so we did the same thing by ability, so the share of low able students within university, and that is significant across all countries. So the more you are in a university that takes in less able kids, the less your mobility experiences. Okay, just another remark on all the other university characteristics. We did not find a coherent picture on whether they can explain uptake. So for example, excellence increases in Hungary the probability for international student mobility, but it decreases it in Italy, and so on. So we cannot really show that teaching load, proportion of postgraduate students has a similar pattern across European countries. Next slide, please. So there are not a lot of limitations, and I can talk about those during our discussion. Next slide, please. So what are the conclusions? So in some point, we can explain international student mobility to some degree, 60% in the UK, but only 30% in Hungary, 20% in Italy, and 10% in Germany. So we are still far away, even if you take universities into account, to explain the gap and hence the mechanism behind it. What individual factors matter besides SES? We said ability, but also only to a limited degree. Next slide, please. Do universities matter? Yeah, we showed that uptake depends. So a lot of the variation in uptake can be explained by the university a student attends. And we find also that across all countries and models, disadvantaged students not only lose out on mobility experience due to their background, but they are also clustered in universities with fewer mobility opportunities. So university segregation is of importance. Next slide, please. So this was this one kind of research that focused really on the university characteristics, background, this meso level, at the level of the countries. Okay, now I would like to take you the level of at the university. Okay, and there, next slide, please. I'd like to what we are focusing on is just one single university in Italy, the University of Bologna, and there we focus on bachelor students who graduated between 2012 and 2019 and who answered the Alma Laurea survey. And so we have something like 46,000 graduates in 102 degree programs. Next slide, please. And the point of going at such a small disaggregated level is to really look at something that we cannot do at the country level, because before I showed you unequal uptake in Erasmus mobility, and that is what all studies do outside at the moment. They all look at the gap at uptake of Erasmus mobility, but being an international student mobility or an Erasmus student, that is a result of a selection process. And the first question we want to look at here, is where at the selection process does this gap get into it? Where do the disadvantaged students drop out? That's the first question. And the second one is, I mean, the universities, when students are in the university, they are in a specific degree program. It's not a university as such that organizes all the Erasmus mobility. It is a degree program. You are in there, the faculty that matters. So we go down to the degree program and want to see whether they matter. Next slide, please. So first, the question on the selection, okay? How do you become an Erasmus student? And this research project is only an Erasmus student, not overall international student mobility. So in Bologna, you first have to write an application. So students have to write a motivation letter, a study plan, and information, need to give information on language skills. Then there is the first selection stage, which is an eligibility check. So if they look that you fulfill language requirements. And after that, there's a selection by ability. So student gets ranked on the quality of the application, and only the best ones get taken. Okay, so the ability selection, and then the student gets the grant, but then the students need to decide to take it up. Okay, so that's a participation step. Okay, so these are the four kind of things. Next slide, please. The big question is, where is this gap between advantaged and disadvantaged students introduced? So here you see a graph which shows on the y-axis the share of disadvantaged students in the overall, okay, the share of disadvantaged students. And now at different populations. So the first one, the 66%, shows you when we take all our graduates at Bologna together in our so all the graduates, then 66% have a disadvantaged background, okay? And now we only look in the second step at those students that applied. And suddenly it's just 55% who have a lower socioeconomic background. So you see there's a huge drop in the representation of disadvantaged students from the population to the application. Then the next step is an eligibility applicant, so the decline. So what happens when once we focus only on the eligible students? There is a decline in the representation of disadvantaged students, but it's tiny. Surprisingly, if we then look at the ability selection, which perhaps most of you would have thought is actually important, right? Once we take this ability, there's a tiny decline, it's not really big. And then the uptake, once you have your grant, so those who then do the uptake, so this is what the literature focuses on, the last part, right? Erasmus participants, there's also a tiny decline. So what the result of this is that 90% of the socioeconomic background gap that we find among Erasmus students derives entirely from the application phase. So the application phase is a culprit. Next slide, please. We also want to look at the degree course level, at the organization of the degree course level. And what you see here is, again, in some way, the percentage point lower. So now we focus on the gap again between advantage and disadvantage students in the application, because we have identified that the application is a problem. So we investigate what are the factors that drive the application problems. Okay, so the percentage point difference between disadvantaged and advantaged students in applications. And you see the unconditional one is something like 7.7 percentage points. Then we condition on occupation, because measuring socioeconomic background is always a little bit tricky. It only declines a little bit to 7.2. Then we take ability into account, and you see there's a drop. There's a drop of 1.3 percentage points. So ability matters, but it's far away from explaining the 7.2 percentage. So ability selection is not the main story here. Then we take other individual factors into account. There's not much change. And then we take degree courses into account. And you see that there's a considerable drop in the gap. So this shows you, and this gap, this drop is at least similar or even bigger than that for ability. This shows you that the organization at the degree course level and how students are clustered into degree courses impacts on the gap. So there is a story to tell here. Next slide, please. So just to conclude from that, and perhaps a little bit further, I don't show you all the results here for this one, but 90% of the SES gap in Erasmus uptake is due to the application. And we show, looking at different subject areas, that if a subject, a degree program or a field of study has where it's more normal, like languages, to take part in mobility, the gap is so much smaller. So the curriculum might be quite important. If we would withdraw ability selection at the university level, it's unlikely that the SES gap would be much smaller. And almost, I didn't show you that, but almost 30% of the variation in the Erasmus uptake can be explained by degree course uptake. And taking degree courses into account decreases the gap between advantaged and disadvantaged students by about 25%. So it shows the importance of that. But also, like the previous results I showed you, also the composition of degree courses matters. So the higher the concentration of lower socioeconomic background students, the lower the number of Erasmus applications. Next slide, please. So out of all this, what are the policy implications, and are there some messages to draw for future outlook? So I hope I managed to convince you that we need to look beyond the student level, that we need to look at universities, and that's perhaps also important to look at disaggregated levels of universities. And consequently, in some way, policies could be implemented at these levels and might have success in decreasing the gap in socioeconomic uptake. So, for example, intergovernmental policies could aim at distributing grants and mobility opportunities more equally across universities, because that's not done at the moment. So that everybody can benefit independent of the background of students who attend the universities. Universities could equally take care that grants are distributed more equally across fields of studies. And then, as I showed you, there's a huge country difference in what matters. So we really need still the single country studies to figure out what happens, because the education system matters within countries. Next slide, please. What about the future outlook? I think on purpose, I showed you here two studies that were very different. One that focused overall on countries and hence on a very aggregated area. This is very nice because we see, because very often, you have single studies and then you think, but is this single study on Italy now also applicable for Germany? So in this way, it is quite nice to have to look at several countries, okay? But then the area level of aggregation is very, very high. So then it's very, very difficult to say something about how does student support work and things like that, which are important. And on the other hand, we have disaggregated studies like the University of Bologna study, where you then wonder, okay, so in Bologna, 90% of the application phase 90% of the gaps in the application phase. But do we find the same in Hungary or in the UK or wherever? You know, how much can we generalize that? So it's always a balancing act. The more aggregated we go, the less information we have, which actually is important. The less we go down, the more we go down, the less we can generalize. So the point is that we need more data, and we need more graduate data. We need better graduate data. I mean, what I already showed you on the 4 countries, that was good data because it has a university level identifier, which many data sets don't have. So this is what we need in order, for example, to merge with ETA, in order to get information in universities out. And that is not only important for student mobility, that is important to find out which universities use which mechanisms in order to create better European workforce in the future. So we need to think about these university level identifiers that we need. And we also need more student level factors, because I think a lot of what I could not explain is to some degrees that it's very difficult to get access to the data. And next slide, please. With that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. And the next one, the thank you slide. Yes, I'm looking forward to a discussion and to what Kristina is saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'll try to stop sharing. Stop share. Okay. So thank you so much for this extremely interesting presentation. I must admit, it's not my main research topic, so I learned a lot. I give the word to Kristina. If you could stay in 5-6 minutes, this would be kind to keep also time for a general discussion. We cannot hear you.
Now?
Yes.
Sorry, my headphones were loose. So thank you, Benedetto, and thank you very much, Sylke, for this rich presentation. I'm glad I had the chance also to read the paper beforehand. There's so much to learn. It does, as you mentioned, build on the well-established and unfortunately still ongoing, as our newest Eurostudent report shows, existing gap between students from different educational backgrounds with regard to international student mobility. But what really I'm taking away from the 2 research endeavors you showed is the importance of taking into account also the university level and the degree course level as potentially exploratory factors, which, as you also point out at the end, brings us to think about policy implications in a different way as well. So just the overall approach and idea, I think, are already as such quite valuable, and then of course also well implemented. I am just going, as Benedetto said, due to limited time, highlight a few main points which struck me and which maybe we can then continue discussing. One point that you also mentioned several times, and it's not also related or is not actually especially in the focus of your research, but more so in mine. I would like to bring up again, despite the importance of degree course and university importance, the individual factors. You bring several into your models, which are relevant from a rational choice theory perspective, and in the end also already had a little wish list of things that you would like to include. I brought you some because in Eurostudent we have some factors or some knowledge which goes a bit into this area. So what are the obstacles for students from non-tertiary educated backgrounds that they report to us in our European student survey that prevent them from going abroad? The main one, I mean, for both groups, the main obstacles to international student mobility, regardless of educational background, is finances. So the potential financial burden of going abroad, you said it, the Erasmus grant might not be enough, is money, but more so for students whose parents aren't highly educated. One aspect that hasn't been mentioned, however, and which is the second, where the second largest difference is the separation students fear from their family and also children. And I think this is a new aspect to bring in, because what we also know from Eurostudent about students from non-tertiary educated backgrounds is that they are quite different from their peers in several regards. It starts early. They have a different kind of decision process to go into higher education. They often enter later and through alternative entry routes, and then obviously are older and so more likely to already have a family. And I mean, it's different to decide to go abroad if you're like 20 and single, or 30 and have 2 small children and a job, because they also much more often support themselves or rely on public support rather than on their parents. So this brings in the financial aspect again. But so this is a new obstacle to maybe to take into account, and also the fear of losing the jobs that they have. So students with lower education background work more and then are afraid if they go abroad for 5 months, yeah, what about my job, which I need to earn money when I come back. Also language, which you mentioned. But interestingly, we also ask about some variables related to the higher education institution directly. So how is there a difference in the information the university provides, or is it possible to integrate your stay abroad into the study program? And here we really don't see a big problem. Well, there are problems, but it's not the biggest problems, and there aren't such big differences between the groups according to educational background. So that's interesting. I also thought about it a bit, but don't really know what that tells us. So like you say, I mean, there is more than ability, and maybe the Eurostudent results inspire some thinking in that regard. So that about the conceptualization. Another point, maybe you also touched on it several times regarding the generalizability. Maybe you can comment a bit more on that. You note yourself the importance of Erasmus already varies quite a bit in those countries or as a main mobility vehicle, so to say. To also add some Eurostudent insights into that, we know that there are countries, especially in the Nordics, where not even half of the students use Erasmus to go abroad. And there are national programs which are used a lot more, or independent organizations. For example, in Norway, that's really the most common way for students to go abroad. Also, these clearly defined mobilities, which are the focus of your research, aren't not necessarily the most common type. If we look at all of Europe, in Austria or Malta, we see more internships abroad, for example, or in the Netherlands, research stays, summer schools, language courses, things like this. And here we also find the selectivity, but I wonder if you think there would be the same kind of obstacles for these, or would it, I mean, could you think your approach could be taken to investigate other types as well, or in countries where Erasmus isn't really that important, if something might need to be changed? Looking at the time, I will just pick one point. Yes, I have to say this is something that confused me a bit, namely the aggregation indices you used for segregation and for ability in the multi-level model. So I wonder if it isn't a bit of a chicken and egg issue if we have a variable which is known to have an effect on level 1 aggregated to level 2, what we see there as a level 2 effect isn't just an artifact of the level 1 effect if we don't have an interaction term in there, or using a different kind of segregation index not derived directly from the level 1 variable or from the ability variable. Maybe I'm not clear on the question, but maybe because it confused me a bit. It has having low ability students cluster in low ability universities, which then predict low propensity to go abroad, somehow seemed a bit circular to me. So maybe you could just explain that again. I will leave it here. I see Benedetto is waving already. So that's it from my side for now.
So thank you so much. Sorry for this, but it's my role to keep the time. Sylke, would you like to take 5 minutes to answer, and then we have half an hour for a more general discussion?
Okay, thank you.
You don't need to answer to all points, of course.
I don't need to answer to all points. It's luxury. I can select the ones I like. Okay, that's nice. So first, I think the Euro student data are very interesting data, and you saw I already referred to them because they give us an overview of all European countries. I think however, what you do with the Euro student data, right? It's going even at a more aggregated level, so that it's more difficult to look at some smaller parts in terms of Erasmus organization, so that it's impossible to look beyond the individual characteristics. I absolutely agree that it's finances. I knew you will say that. I knew finances is there. That's something we cannot take into account. We just don't have it in graduate data. Okay, we have only proxies for it. You say the separation is an important factor, indeed, and you remember that I said when we have older, we can condition on the age of students. And indeed, for 2 countries, we saw that the gap declined once we do that. And I think this is exactly due to what you say, due to this separation problem, due to the family issues and so on that are standing behind there. But you saw for 2 other countries, it wasn't so important. So yes, so I do also believe that this is an issue, but that we normally in normal graduate surveys that are not specifically selected for student mobility, you never have this information, which is very sad. Yes, and languages was good to hear. I mean, that makes absolutely sense. I'm just short question. Do you have ability in there? Do you have upper secondary school degrees? Okay, because that's something that we have. So, and I think to some degree, the ability proxies some of these things, but I can't say to what degree. Okay, so the generalizability, that's very difficult. I can't say anything about that because honestly, we just because we look at these 4 countries, and you already see for these 4 countries, once you look at university importance of university characteristics for Erasmus uptake, you remember the teaching load and so on. It has very different effects across different countries. So I would lean myself far out of the window if I would say something, oh, I can generalize here in any kind of way. And we really also looked only at Erasmus or international student mobility going abroad. We did not look at having an internship somewhere abroad or something like that. So I would be...
Oh, you muted yourself.
Apologies. So the reason why we look at international student mobility is because that's the most one done, right? And consequently, we have the biggest sample sizes, hence we have the biggest precision in our estimates. And how it works with internships and so on, I don't know. I really can't say. And then the last point for me, I hope I caught the other ones, is the one of the chicken and egg. And that is that you say, look, you use your individual level characteristics in order to derive a university level variable. I don't think that this is a problem. It is in education research quite often done if you focus on peer effects, right? There's a lot of research on peer effects, and that they do exactly that. They calculate, for example, this PISA data, lots of research out there, they calculate, they say something about achievement, and then they calculate within the school the peer effects based on the achievement. So it's something very similar that we do. So I don't think that there's such a big problem here. However, I think there's a problem in terms of that we have a variable at the university level that is summarized with survey data, and hence we have a considerable measurement by measurement error, which will lead to an accentuation bias, which will lead to downwards estimate at the university level. So I also see problems here with that. I hope, Kristina, that was okay and sufficient.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful. And I would like to intervene exactly on the last points, because I think there are a couple of directions you could go. One, of course, it will depend on the socio-demographic data, but ITER at least has 10 years of data. So it would be useful at some point to test the use of panel models, because especially at the university level, you have lost unobserved heterogeneity, which you can model. And the second one is exactly what Kristina said. As I see, it's more something interesting to research. So of course you have social status segregation by universities, and then you have social status segregation by mobility. And if you think one moment, this is something like a two-stage, first students segregate into some universities, then the question is how much remaining segregation in mobility is explained by the mobility selection process. And that this would call probably for something like mediation or model or structural equation modeling, where you can really model the two stages. So one model, the social segregation into university, and one, the social segregation in mobility conditional to the composition of student body into the university. So this might be very interesting, because this came up very interestingly in your conclusions. Because if you know, for example, that most of the effect is the segregation within universities, then you are perfectly right that as soon as you distribute grants for mobility based on a student's population, you follow just this effect, and you and so this two-stage might really help understanding better where the policies have to intervene. But I would like to open for further questions and give you back the word. Questions? Yes, sir. Could you say your name, because I see Ete Karas, and you are also muted.
It's okay now?
Yes.
Okay. So myself, I'm president of ETech Institute. So it's founded on the basis of bilateral relations between European Union and India. There are some questions like at which stage I'm agreed with the entire discussion, and it's just there's a question and the question and it's equally a solution to that. At which stage of point, like for example, 23 years back when I was student at University of Lille, we did have these options to go in exchange with other countries like China, Japan, and European countries as well. So I myself place at that moment, and equally we work only with students who comes from the similar university background. So the thing is, at which stage of point the Erasmus Plus is placed? If it is going to place for example, if the course is of one academic year and half academic year, you have to go with a partner university apart from France or Germany or any UK or any Italy. So the reply as a foreign international student will be no, because the reason is it's not even the point of application of Erasmus Plus. It's a point of the application when the student decide to choose a country. Okay, when he decides to choose a country, is that he should after his studies he should have a professional experience background. Otherwise he cannot after his studies investments, it's even time, his talent, or financial. So if I've gone to Germany, if I don't know the system and I don't have a practical experience after my studies, is that no, I will not have a career opportunity later to my studies. So if the solution is, if this Erasmus Plus is placed in between the course curriculum of the host university and the receiving university for Erasmus Plus, it's a bonus. So because I will gain the experience and expertise of 2 countries. But if it's placed at the end, it is a problematic thing that no student would like to diversify and have like to end result will be like the example was eggs and chicken. The example will be here is jack of all trade and master of none science.
Okay, so thank you. Should we collect another question? So otherwise, I go back to Sylke. In the meantime, prepare your further questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for these questions. So, Benedetto, regarding the longitudinal data, I'm using ETA. I'm not quite sure whether I understood, because to my background, I don't know the share of socioeconomic background disadvantaged students at university level from ETA. And this is why we needed to construct them at the survey data level. And what we have individual level data. To that, we add ETA data for the university multi-level modeling. So the longitudinal data at the university level, I wouldn't know how a longitudinal approach would change. I didn't understand the point. The second one,
no, just do you have longitudinal data from the surveys, or?
Yeah, that's very different. HESA, for example, the UK one has been discontinued.
Yeah, okay.
So, okay, probably yes, for Germany, we can probably go on. I have to tell you, looking at using 4 different graduate surveys, I cannot say how tedious this was. and then, you know, as I said, I think a lot of the results we find because we still lack data. So I'm not quite sure. Yes, but I think it would be lovely to see it over time. I absolutely agree, and certainly we very much appreciated having the ETA data to look at things that normally the graduate data doesn't cover. The 2-stage is a good point. Well, that's something for reflection. I don't say much about this because I need to reflect about this, and I think that's a good idea. Coming back to the president of ETEX, thank you very much for your comment. And I'm not quite sure I completely understood it. And I think I rushed through my slides, which might not have made things much easier, because just focusing on, so we look at bachelor students, okay? And these programs are 3 years long.
Okay.
And for the University of Bologna, we have this direct data, and we can directly see at which time these students go. And most of them go in year 2, and a very small proportion go in 3 years 3. So the problem is not so much there because it's longer than 1 year. But sorry, I didn't explain that better.
No, just
thank you.
Thank you very much for this reply, because yes, you rightly replied, and my thought process was towards the master's students. So okay, it's crystal clear now.
Okay,
thank you.
And just last question: can we have this presentation by mail?
Yes.
Yes.
Can I please try to follow the order? I see Kristina will raise the hand.
Yes, thank you. Just building on what Sylke said about the headache of working with 4 different surveys, which I can completely imagine. As a DZHW representative, I would like to point out the Euro Graduate Scientific Use file, which is coming out. I have to say, because I'm not directly involved in that project, I'm not sure to which extent ITER identifiers are included. And it might also be interesting, the current round of Euro student is also planning a scientific use file with ITER. Well, then I don't want to say too much. And we are currently working on including ITER identifiers. Question is, because it has to be very limited if they are particularly useful, but then there might be at least some way to investigate the variance and the different obstacles we have, and so on. So that might also be interesting. But the European Graduate Survey could also be an interesting avenue.
Thank you, Kristina. Further questions? Yes. Stephanie.
Yes, hello, I'm Stephanie. I'm from the Swiss National Agency, Movetia, so we're based in Switzerland. And I found it very interesting, this chicken and egg question, because actually we had sort of a similar issue. We tried to come up with a mobility study for the first time that is nationwide, so for Switzerland, and compare the different universities among themselves to see which university has the highest mobility rate and how far from the 20% goal we are as a country, and how far from the goal every individual institution is as well. And we had the problem that we sort of, at the end of the study, we noticed that, well, we measured the mobility index, as we call it. We measured how many graduates from each institution went on a mobility during their studies at some point, any kind of mobility longer than 2 months. And so we came up with this sort of ranking. And so the institutions that had fewer or lower mobility rates were those with less graduates going on the mobility. And then we thought, well, this means that maybe we have a cluster effect of people that are in those institutions that have fewer opportunities and that don't go on mobility. But we couldn't really use that, because actually what we used to measure the mobility index was actually how many people were going on a mobility. So we had this sort of cyclic effect. So this is something that we would find interesting, but we also had it just as sort of a question at the end of the story. So just to tie into this kind of question, how you measure that across institutions and across the country as well.
Thank you. Sylke, do you want to rejoin at this point?
Obviously, this point is quite important for everybody. So I'm not quite sure, Stephanie, whether I can help you. I just wanted to perhaps say that in our modeling, we calculate the socioeconomic background variable of universities, right? And then we use that as an explanatory variable. Kristina mentioned that there needs to be some interaction effects, and we also did some interactions with this different way. We, for example, looked whether low socioeconomic background students in universities with lower socioeconomic background overall fare differently. But that wasn't the case. Also, we ran a number of things. We also did this for ability, we didn't find anything. Just because I forgot to say that before, but yeah, it's a tricky issue.
Thank you. Next question. Otherwise, I have one more. Do you have evidence of sorting in terms of the university where students move? Because I might expect this effect. So I might expect that students with higher socioeconomic background tend to move towards better universities, for example. I'm asking because it's something which I'm starting to think about the subtleties of this kind of equality issues. So just the most visible example is that we achieved that there are much less socioeconomic disparity in access to higher education, but then the disparities have reproduced themselves within higher education. You find better off people in some domains in better universities. The analysis we did combining ITER and Euro students shows it clearly, and we might have the same issue with mobility. So preferentially low background students moving to less reputed universities in terms of when are mobile. Do you have some evidence on that?
No, that is really a very interesting question. And I know that for the Bologna data, so just focus on Bologna, we have that. But I'm not quite sure that so we didn't do it for this paper. We didn't do it for this paper. We have another paper where we focus on the impact. And I think there we had a look, but I can't remember. And I think it's really interesting. For the other 4 surveys, I think there might be information, but not for all countries. And hence we didn't really take it into account. We had some country specific, kind of variables that we plugged in. For example, for Germany, Fachhochschule is the explanatory factor of the socioeconomic gap. I didn't say much about it. So there are some country-specific factors, but we didn't look at it. But your point on the, on the more universal access, this is something that we made by comparing the countries, because the UK has a huge higher education expansion. There are 50% of people now at higher universities, right? Whereby in Italy, it's just 30%, yeah? So what we argued a little bit about, what we found about the university was that we said, look, in some ways, this is student mobility, taking part in it is some kind of way of keeping your hierarchical status, because everybody goes now to university, but being a mobile student in the UK is something like where you can keep your status up if you do that. Thereby, that's not so much the case in Germany or something like that. There in somewhere, or in Italy, where we have different kind of higher education expansion. But I think that's a very, very interesting point to investigate further.
Yes, thank you. And what maybe I suggest would be interesting, maybe somebody here has information, is on labor market outcomes. Because what I'm noticing doing selection of personnel for the university services is now having a university diploma is just a baseline, and then you start looking something in it. So in a way, the leveling effect on labor market opportunities of an higher education diploma is going lost, because it's not anymore a reliable signal in terms of ability or. Okay, other questions or comments? I think we had a very, very interesting presentation. It's obvious the relevance for policy. It's obvious the data challenges, because we are moving between the micro and the meso level, and unlike when you work with researchers where you can resort to bibliometric databases to get systematic information on individuals, on students, you cannot. So there are some challenges ahead. You might know the European Commission just launched the tender for the new higher education observatory, and they are speaking about coordinating survey strategies, which seems to me a very important topic, because it's not that we don't have surveys of students, we have too many probably, but combining these surveys and combining them with institutional level data remains a challenge. So there is certainly potential for improving there, and for thinking of requirements in terms of the analysis you want to do, because if surveys are not designed properly within IET usage, you might just not be able to work on them. Temporal continuity is a typical case in point. If you cannot use different waves together or longitudinal aspects, it's lost. If there are no further comments, I would like first to thank Sylke and Kristina, and thank all of you for participation, and wish you will be so interested as you were today for the next seminar. Will be 25th of October at 12:30 as usual, and the topic is again very, very important from a policy perspective. So the relationship between university expenditures and research performance, and presentation by Jürgen Janger from the Austrian Institute of Economic Research, and we have a very distinguished discussant, Cinzia D'Araio from Sapienza University. So I really hope and wish you will further attend this series. And finally, I have still to thank this IRCRES team in Rome, Alessia and Serena, for managing the seminar and its promotion. Thank you to everybody, and have a nice afternoon.